When the Gaulish peoples are mentioned, we think of naked warriors, mysterious Druids, and a defeated warlord knelt before the Roman eagle. From their prehistoric origins to their final doomed struggle against Rome, the ancient Celts developed a reputation as proud warriors, capable of savagery and bravery in equal measure. In this special documentary on the Gallic peoples, we will tell the sweeping story of the rise and fall of the robust Iron Age culture which once dominated nearly all of continental Europe. These long episodes are incredibly difficult to make, so consider liking, commenting and sharing to support our work. For the most part, the ancient Celts left virtually no written records of their own existence, so we are reliant almost solely on limited archaeological and etymological evidence to piece together their culture, while in the centuries leading up to the birth of Christ, a scattering of Greek and Roman writings give us a slightly more dynamic window into their society. Neither offer a complete survey of the Celtic world, but they provide us with a workable set of information that, in lieu of anything else, we have no choice but to rely on. The most popular narrative of the Celtic genesis can be found in the town of Hallstatt, which sits nestled against a lake between the idyllic peaks of the Alps. It was here, between the years of 1846 and 1863, that an Austrian mine operator known as Johann Georg Ramsauer excavated the derelict cemetery of an ancient salt mining community. The material culture discovered here was named the Hallstatt culture after the town it was discovered in, and is widely considered to be the birthplace of an early Celtic society. The Hallstatt culture has since been broken up into 4 chronological phases, based on the evolution of artifacts found in its sites. Hallstatt A and B emerged in the Late Bronze Age between 1200 to 800 BC in Central Europe. It was initially a minor deviation of the Indo-European Urnfield complex, an older material culture prominent across much of Central Europe. Hallstatt's society was based on mining salt, copper and tin, and trading them to outlying regions. These were crucial products, for salt was used to preserve meat in winters, while copper and tin were used to forge bronze, the most precious metal of the era. The peoples of the Hallstatt heartland grew prosperous from this trade, which remained a core part of their economy for centuries to come. Around 800 BC, ironworking was introduced to the Hallstatt through trade with the Hittites and Greeks. This started the Hallstatt C era, where the Proto-Celts came into their own as a culture distinct from the Urnfield complex. They built hill forts throughout Central Europe, populating them with artisans and warriors, led by petty chieftains. It was at this point in the early Iron Age that they started developing a class system and social inequality, becoming more hierarchical. Graves excavated from the Hallstatt A and B eras were uniformly simple and egalitarian in nature. However, burials from Hallstatt C onwards show a great disparity in wealth and status. Clustered around their hill forts were great barrow mounds, the resting place of wealthy tribal elites. Here, nobles were buried alongside their treasures such as collars, brooches, axe heads, and other metalworks of bronze, iron, and gold. These valuables oft featured iconic geometric designs and animalistic motifs. The presence of ivory and amber in these barrows suggests that they maintained trade networks that extended as far out as the Baltics and North Africa. Equestrianism was likely a symbol of power and nobility during this era, evidenced by the presence of a distinct style of slender slashing sword present in many graves, best suited for cavalry warfare. Additionally, the highest tribal elites were buried alongside ceremonial bridles, tackles, and ornate horse-drawn cult wagons. The importance of the horse in aristocratic society was likely due to contact with the Indo-Iranian Cimmerians, from whom they adapted the horse and wagon as symbols of tribal power. It was perhaps through the mobility of the horse and their economic and cultural soft power that the Hallstatt peoples expanded out of their traditional heartland and exported their cultural influence across much of Central Europe. The transition from Hallstatt C to D occurred around 600 BC, and was marked by the culture shifting west along the Danube, Rhine and Seine rivers, gravitating towards the Greek colony of Massalia, modern Marseille. The Phocian Greeks of Massalia were the early Celts' gateway to the riches of the Mediterranean world. Through them they imported all sorts of southern luxuries, including fine pottery, glass, and the most precious luxury of all, wine. Late Hallstatt peoples soon began trading with other Mediterranean peoples, including the Phoenicians and the Etruscans, whose advanced civilization we've covered in a previous episode. The first historical mention of the Celts came in 517 BC from the Greek historian Hecataeus of Miletus, who referred to the people living beyond Massalia as Keltoi. This word was possibly borrowed from a tribal endonym, or was Greek for the tall ones, contributing to the enduring stereotype that the average Celt stood a head taller than their Greco-Roman counterparts. Either way, it is a term that we still use today. Late Hallstatt chieftains consolidated a great amount of power by virtue of the foreign wealth they controlled. The many small hill forts that dotted the landscape were largely replaced by fewer but larger population centres, such as the ruins of an impressive tribal complex at Hohenneberg in southern Germany. Meanwhile, the barrow mounds became more splendourous than ever before, inlaid with luxury imports from Greece and Etruria. By around 500 BC, the Hallstatt culture had reached its peak in wealth, territory, and influence. But how can we be sure that the Hallstatt material complex represents the early development of a distinct Celtic culture? First of all, the swords found in late Hallstatt graves closely resemble the weaponry that Greco-Roman writers described the Celts using in later centuries. Secondly, the importance of the symbolic horse and wagon in burials was considered an early form of later Celtic funeral rites, which saw chieftains buried within two-wheeled war chariots. The geometric and animalistic art style of the late Hallstatt era is accepted to be an early form of Celtic artwork, and perhaps most importantly, the name Hallstatt itself is derived from an old Celtic word meaning salt place. This is reinforced by the fact that in the Celtic languages of Welsh, Cornish and Breton, the words for salt are Halwyn, Halloin and Hollain, presumably cognates of the same ancient root as the ancient word from which the name of the modern town of Hallstatt is derived. The evidence all seems to suggest that the Hallstatt heartland was where the Celts emerged as a visible people group, featuring an early form of the Celtic language, tribal hierarchy, and artistic expression. However, this theory has its problems. Although by the late Hallstatt period, artifacts belonging to the culture would be found from Britain to Croatia, it did not mean that all the peoples in these lands were early Celts. Additionally, not all Celtic speakers in the early Iron Age would have belonged to the Hallstatt culture. The early Celtic language that became associated with the Hallstatt heartland developed out of an older Indo-European tongue around 1500 BC, and over centuries spread across much of Central and Western Europe. People on the periphery of the early Celtic world adopted the Proto-Celtic tongue due to the cultural and economic influence of the Hallstatt elites, but did not necessarily adopt the material culture. For example, Ireland and parts of Spain were predominantly Celtic-speaking by the 5th century BC, but the Celtic migrants there had mixed with the indigenous populations of those regions to form the Celtiberian and Gaelic cultures, which had little to no cultural continuity with the Hallstatt complex. Basically, there were those who followed the Hallstatt culture who were not Celtic-speaking, and Celtic-speaking peoples who were not of the Hallstatt culture. The prosperous world of the Hallstatt chieftains came to a sudden end around 450 BC, when the increasingly imperialistic Massalian Greeks decided to abandon their old trade connections to instead try and subjugate the Celts, while the Etruscans shifted their trade routes away from the Hallstatt heartland. As a result, Celtic power shifted to the north, evolving into Hallstatt's dynamic successor, the Tène. The Tène culture lasted from around 450 to 50 BC, and is the most iconic era of ancient Celtic history. Developing in 4 separate tribal centres, principally along the Moselle and Marne rivers, it soon expanded across much of Europe. By 300 BC, the Tène culture was dominant across Central Europe, France, Luxembourg, Belgium and Switzerland, and later would arrive in Britain, Western Spain and Ireland. La Tène artwork was what the conventional mind considers quintessentially Celtic, featuring cauldrons, drinking vessels, weapons, shields, armor and jewelry characterized by stylistic spiral patterns. It is here we slowly transition from relying primarily on archaeological finds and into the written attestations of classical Greek and Roman authors, who, while often biased or misinformed, still give us a workable amount of information in piecing together the Celtic world, its language, politics, society and religion. The general public may be familiar with the word Gaul, a term often used to refer to the Celts of the La Tène world. This title comes from the old Germanic Velhas, meaning foreigner, which the Celts certainly would have been in the eyes of the ancient Germanic tribes. Meanwhile, when a young Roman republic encountered the La Tène Celts across the Alps in northern Italy, they referred to them as Galli, which might have been the name of an individual tribe they applied to the entire ethno-cultural group. We will use the words Gaul, Gallic and Celtic interchangeably, but generally this was not how the peoples in question referred to themselves. Indeed, a common misconception is that there was ever a linguistically or culturally uniform nation of Gallic people. By the La Tène period, Celtic languages had diverged drastically from one another. The main split were the P-Celtic languages, spoken across north-central continental Europe and modern Britain, and Q-Celtic, the more lexically conservative tongues spoken by the Gauls of Ireland and probably the Celtiberians of Spain. This split can still be observed today in the modern Welsh and Irish languages, which are mutually unintelligible due to belonging to the P and Q subgroups respectively. It is unlikely that the speakers of their ancient counterparts would see any common ground between themselves. Gauls and Celtiberians aside, the Gauls of the continent and Britons of the Isle to their north were perpetually a politically divided people. The main form of social organization in the Celtic world was the tribe, ruled by a hereditary chief and his warrior aristocracy. A chief's lands were further subdivided into administrative districts called pagi, governed by lesser houses loyal to the chieftaincy in a system similar to feudalism. Mainly through Roman records, we know that some notable tribes that existed in the Late Iron Age include the Helvetii, Senones, Veneti, and Tectosagis. Some names live on even today, such as the Belgae, who give their name to modern Belgium, or the Parisii, for whom the city of Paris is named. Still, the Gaulish peoples likely acknowledged elements of a common culture that was shared beyond tribal lines. One constant was the social hierarchy. At the top of the pyramid was the chieftain, who, like his Hallstatt ancestors, ruled rural communities from a hill fort, which were constructed with timber lace and stone ramparts the Romans called Murus Gallicus. Under the chief was an elite aristocracy of warrior nobles. Next were craftsmen, mostly consisting of skilled metallurgists who lived in and around the chief's hill fort, supplying the warriors with arms and armor. 90% of Gallic society were subsistence farmers, providing a portion of their production to their chief, who used it to maintain his warrior aristocracy, which in turn protected the farmers from external enemies in a mutualistic relationship. Wheat, barley, beans, oats and peas made up the Gallic diet, while sheep, pigs and cattle were commonly raised for wool, meat and milk. In the south of France, the Celts cultivated grapes and olives. Rather than being a primitive naturalistic people as common perception implies, the Gauls were actually highly developed, with ploughs, iron shares and cultures able to efficiently till even the heaviest soils. Most Gauls lived in small, rural communities in rectangular houses of timber, wattle, daub and clay, well insulated for cold winters. In Britain, Ireland and northwestern Spain, homes were mainly circular and built on unmortared stone. Architecture differed little between the social classes, though the feasting hall of a warrior aristocrat would be larger than a peasant's sheep farm. Greek and Roman writings and sculptures have given us a romanticized image of the average Gaul as a towering, red-maned noble savage sporting a manly moustache while painted head to toe in terrifying war paint. In reality, the average Gaulish man would not have been much taller than the average Roman or Greek. While fashion differed from region to region, the Gauls tended to dress conservatively. Men generally wore long-sleeved tunics and baggy trousers woven from flax and wool. Women tended to wear long dresses, while both sexes were often draped in cloaks decorated with colourful plaid patterns rendered from natural dyes of copper, berries, plants, and stale urine. Personal grooming was highly important to the Celts. For example, both sexes were said to meticulously and painfully pluck all their body hairs. Additionally, there is some truth to the stereotype of the thick Gallic moustache. Depicted often in both Celtic and Greco-Roman iconography, it was likely believed to be a sign of manhood and virility. Gallic warriors were also said to have washed their hair in a mixture of slaked lime and water, which stiffened it into white spikes. Tattoos and skin dyes were not practiced by continental Gauls, and were limited mainly to the ancient Britons, who according to Roman accounts, rendered a bluish dye from the Assatis tinctoria flower called woad, which when applied to their flesh was said to provide magic protection in battle. Often of cultural or spiritual significance, jewellery was common among the upper classes. The brooch, a fastener for a cloak, was a remarkably enduring characteristic of Celtic fashion for centuries. Bracelets and arm rings were common, fashioned in the ornate swirling style characteristic of La Tène art. The torque, a weight metal neck ring, was a symbol of status and rank, said to bestow the protection of the gods to whoever wore it. On that note, we should take a moment to explore the religion of the ancient Celts. There are two major misconceptions of ancient Celtic polytheism, one perpetuated by modern neo-pagan groups, who often portray the ancient Celtic faith as a pure idealized form of proto-environmentalist nature worship, and one perpetuated by the ancient Romans, who sought to portray the Celts as backwards barbarians. The Gaulish gods did not belong to an ordered pantheon, and religion across the Celtic world was not uniform. Today we know of over 400 Gallic deities, most being the holy patron of a single tribe, or a local god associated with a certain area, like Sequana, who was worshipped only at the mouth of the river Seine. However, there are a handful of gods who were prominent across the Celtic world. These would include the thunder-wielding Taranis, Mapanos the god of youth, Belinus the sun god, Kennenos the horned one, Epona the horse goddess, and Tutatis the warlike tribal protector. One of their most popular gods was Lug, patron of business, trade and technology, dismantling the misconception that Celtic polytheism was purely naturalistic. Celtic religious rites were rigidly structured and not unlike the Olympian religion when it came to sacrifice and divination. It was facilitated by a class of professional priests, the Druids. Today, the Druids conjure up a popular image of mysterious, long-bearded elders in white robes. However, they actually wielded massive political influence, often serving as peacemakers and diplomats on behalf of their chieftains, mediating legal matters, serving as healers, and heading education in their tribe. Training in order to become a Druid involved an intense 20-year regimen in which a dedicant had to memorize a massive array of oral histories, lore, medicinal knowledge, astronomy, religious rituals, and divination practices. Meanwhile, magic potions that bestow superhuman strength on their drinkers are regrettably absent from Druidic historiography. The Druids likely belonged to a common order that existed beyond tribal lines. They hosted a pan-Gaulish meeting each year among the forests of the Carnites, sacred ground where major political or religious issues were settled between tribes, making them a key vehicle in maintaining a common identity among the many tribes. One of the key duties of a Druid was to officiate sacrifices to the gods. Human sacrifice is often described as a core part of Celtic ritual. According to the Roman author Lucan, different gods called for different forms of ritual slaughter. Tutus's victims were drowned in a vat of water, while Taranis called for men to be beheaded or burned alive in giant effigies of straw. According to the Greek historian Diodorus, human victims were also sacrificed for the purposes of divination. The Druids never wrote anything down, keeping their knowledge a secret restricted to members of their order. we will never have their own accounts of their religious rites, while the Roman authors who wrote about these practices had a vested interest in making their Celtic enemies look savage and barbarous. We can't deny the existence of human sacrifice, but we should also keep in mind the limited perspective that modern scholars have been offered on the subject. Between the 4th and 2nd centuries BC, Latin Celtic culture had assimilated its way across a staggering amount of Europe. This is exemplified by modern-day countries as far apart as Portugal and Ukraine, which both have provinces named Galatia, land of the Gauls. Warfare played a huge role in this continental spread, which begs the question, what made the Celts such effective fighters? The stereotypical image of the Gallic warrior, perpetuated by Greco-Roman writers, is that of a savage, ferocious in spirit, but primitive in equipment and strategy. However, the full story is much more complex. For one thing, Gaulish arms and armour were highly advanced for their time. The Celts were master ironworkers who were able to arm their warriors with longswords and spears with specialized tips for either thrusting or throwing, making the average Gaul deadly in melee and ranged combat. For protection, the Gallic fighters bore a long oakwood shield with a hard iron boss for blunt force bashing. Most warriors wore Agan and Port type helmets, featuring a brimmed iron dome and a pair of wing-like cheek guards. There is also evidence that the Gauls were the inventors of chainmail, based on surviving pictorial evidence of a type of metal cuirass made of tightly linked iron rings, the earliest historical example of such technology. The Romans were so impressed by Gallic metallurgy that the legionary's helmet, his lorica hamata armour, and even his gladius and spatha swords were all adapted from Celtic or Celtiberian designs. So Roman armour as we know it today actually owes its iconic form in huge part to the innovations of the Celts. However, among the Celts themselves, body armour was rare, mainly reserved for select high-ranking nobles, while most warriors went into battle wearing just shirts, trousers, or in some cases, nothing at all. The naked warrior is one of the most enduring legends of Celtic history. Historical evidence suggests a significant amount of Celts did fight nude, either for religious purposes or to inspire fear in their enemies. Surviving depictions of bare-skinned Celtic combatants in both artwork and historical record suggest that while the majority of Gauls did not fight naked, the practice was fairly normalized. The use of the iconic war chariot also bears mentioning, as they were used both as versatile mobile missile units and also as basic transport vehicles, quickly ferrying warriors from one theatre of battle to another. For all their arms and armour, the principal advantage of the Gallic army was their ability to utterly terrify their foe. Both Roman and Greek records report on the petrifying nature of the Celts, claiming that before any engagement they would roar and brag, performing ritualistic war dances while bellowing a deafening sound out of their boar-headed war trumpets. Put yourself in the shoes of a superstitious plebeian fresh off an ancient olive farm or the slums of Rome, and you can appreciate the supernatural terror that a mob of screaming, dancing, horn-blaring muscle men must have had. In terms of battle tactics, the Celts kept things fairly simple. Skilled javelin throwers would soften up the enemy formation, while chariot and cavalry riders would be used to flank and harass. For the most part, a Gallic victory banked entirely on a disorganized, blood-drunk charge, the impact of which was usually enough to rout the enemy formation, making it easy to slaughter them piecemeal. Ancient Celtic warfare may have lacked the discipline of a legion or phalanx, but it wasn't primitive or basic. To the Gauls, war was a way of life, and their dynamic formula of inspiring terror in their enemies and fearlessness among themselves was what saw their armies come to dominate not just the majority of continental Europe, but also take them right up to the doorstep of a young Roman Republic. From about 450 BC, Gallic northern and central Europe became overpopulated, and many enterprising Celtic war leaders led their retinues southwards to Italy, which the Celts knew to be a bountiful land of olives, figs, and wine. According to Livy, they first entered the peninsula as early as 600 BC, when a multi-tribal band of immigrants, led by the king Bellovesus of the Bituriges, crossed the Alps and made war on the northern cities of the Etruscans, a culturally sophisticated but politically independent network of city-states whose heartland was in modern-day Tuscany. Upon driving the Etruscans out of the Po Valley, the Gauls founded the settlement of Mediolanum, the modern city Milan. Other waves of migration followed, and by 400 BC, various Gallic tribes had established themselves as the masters of a chunk of northern Italy that stretched from the Alps to the Adriatic coast. Indigenous Ligures to the west and Veneti to the east eventually became culturally assimilated by their Celtic neighbours. The Gauls were on the rise, but they were not the only growing power in Italy. In 400 BC, the city of Rome was a smallish city-state of some 25,000, living in humble homes of brick and timber, with a long ways to go to the eternal city of marble it later became. Nevertheless, in the last 100 years, the Romans had established hegemony over all of the cities of the Latin League, overthrew their monarchy, and emerged as a dynamic republic. In 396 BC, the brilliant Roman commander Marcus Furius Camillus conquered the Etruscan city of Veii, establishing a foothold for further northwards expansion, putting Rome on a collision course with the Celts. Modern historians are split on how the First Gallo-Roman War broke out. Some claim that a Gallic tribe invaded Rome on behalf of Dionysius I, the tyrant of the Greek city of Syracuse, who wanted to knock the Romans down a peg for supporting his rivals in Messina. Others claim that the warlike Celts needed no incentive to invade Rome, and simply did so for glory and plunder. According to Dionysius of Halicarnassus, the seeds of conflict were sown when the king of the Etruscan Clusium, Lucamo, engaged in a dalliance with a married woman. Her aggrieved husband, an influential merchant named Arruns, went north to the Gauls of the Po Valley, seeking to use them as his instrument of revenge by convincing them to attack Clusium. Arruns' call was answered by King Brennus of the Senones, who was happy to make war on Clusium, coveting its riches and fertile lands. The people of Clusium were alarmed by the Gallic horde and called to the Romans for aid. In response, the Roman Senate sent a trio of ambassadors to serve as neutral mediators. When the ambassadors asked Brennus why he made war on Clusium, he tersely replied, "For the same reason Rome conquers her neighbours." Tensions soon flared, and an armed quarrel broke out between the representatives of the Clusians and Senones. In the heat of the moment, one of the Roman ambassadors slew a Senone warrior. Brennus was infuriated by the breach in diplomatic conduct and sent envoys to Rome calling for the extradition of all three ambassadors, but his demands were refused. Thus the Gauls declared a blood feud upon the Romans and advanced southwards to settle the score. The military tribunes of Rome quickly mustered an army and marched out to meet their foe. In the 5th century BC, Rome was centuries away from fielding the professional legion. Wealthier citizens armed themselves in the style of the Greek hoplite, but the majority fought with various destandardized weapons and little protection. They made their stand on the river Alia. In modern historiography, our understanding of the Battle of the Alia relies heavily on the accounts of two Roman historians, Livy and Diodorus Siculus. Neither of these can be taken wholly at face value, since both authors have their inherent biases, and, more importantly, lived over 3 centuries after the events in question, meaning that neither penned down first-hand accounts of the battle, but rather chronicled a story which by their time had already been passed down for countless generations. Nevertheless, our interpretation of this battle will anchor itself mainly on Livy's testimony in the interest of simplicity and linearity. And a scathing testimony it is, for Livy has almost nothing good to say about his Roman ancestors. After choosing the place in which they would meet their barbarian nemesis, the consular tribunes in charge of the Roman army behaved with flagrant negligence, failing to set up a proper camp, build defensive ramparts, or perform the proper sacrificial rites to their gods to ensure that divine fortune was on their side. Moreover, Livy also criticizes the Roman battle formation, which consisted of a single line, presumably with those rich enough to have armed themselves with a full hoplites panoply forming into a standard phalanx formation. The tribunes stretched out their wings, with the right being positioned in reserve on a nearby hill. This was done to prevent being outflanked, but only contributed to the weakening of the centre, which was now spread far too thin to form an effective defensive lockstep. Perhaps the most egregious mistake the consuls made was to position their army perpendicularly across the Alia river, which put their backs to its distributary, the mighty Tiber. In doing so, the Romans had essentially limited their own maneuverability and backed themselves against a wall. On July 18th, Brennus's Gallic host crested over the horizon, likely outnumbering the Romans significantly. No enemy the Romans had faced thus far, be they Etruscans, Sabines, or their fellow Latins, commanded the petrifying aura of the pale, long-haired giants who now stood across the field from them. Fear spread like a pox through the Roman line, with Livy claiming that the Gauls' hideous howls and discordant clamour filled everything with dreadful noise. After performing a quick survey of his enemy's battle formation, Brennus quickly deduced that the Roman right flank was the greatest threat, for if he attacked the Roman centre head-on, the reserves on the hill could circle down and attack him from the rear. In typical Gaulish fashion, Brennus addressed this hazard directly, ordering his fiercest soldiers to charge the hill and dislodge the Roman right from its position. Thus did the Gauls begin their thunderous charge, howling, screaming, and blaring their carnixies. As the Celtic warriors closed in, they unleashed a withering hail of javelins upon their foes, which thinned out their quarry enough that when they charged up the bluff and slammed into the reservist line, the legionnaires almost immediately broke. Seeing their brethren on the right collapse, morale on the Roman left and in the centre plummeted. Consumed by paralytic terror, they began routing, seemingly before the Gauls had even engaged them. They turned their backs on their foe and fled, only to find themselves up against the banks of the Tiber. Thousands of Romans attempted the river crossing, with many drowning, weighed down by their armour, and many more cut down by the pursuing Gauls as they clogged up the riverbank in their chaotic, panicked retreat. However, after the pandemonium and slaughter had subsided, most of the Roman army had escaped to the other side of the rapids, where they fled behind the walls of Veii, a city Rome had conquered not one decade prior. The Battle of the Alia was a testament to how effective Gaulish fear tactics could be upon an enemy who was unprepared to face them. For centuries thereafter, a fear of Celts would be ingrained into the Roman national psyche, as the reckless ferocity of the Gallic horde rendered them into something akin to savage bogeymen, the wolves prowling at civilization's door. After his decisive victory, King Brennus led the Senones to Rome and put the city to the torch. It was the first time the Eternal City had ever been sacked, and it would take 800 years for any other foreign army to ever do so again. According to later Roman historians, a surviving core of senators and able-bodied citizens were able to retreat to the citadel on the Capitoline Hill to mount a defense, watching helplessly while the rest of the city was thoroughly pillaged. The Senones twice tried to take the Capitoline, first with a frontal assault, which was repulsed, and second with a nighttime infiltration, which was famously foiled by the honking of the sacred geese of Juno. After many months of impasse, both sides had become emaciated by starvation and plague. The Romans' resolve broke first, and they agreed to pay the Senones a sum of 1,000 pounds of gold to make them leave. Here Roman historian Livy claims that the Gauls weighted the measuring scales to cheat the Romans out of more tribute than had been agreed upon. When the Romans protested, Brennus threw his own sword onto the scale, bellowing "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. According to Diodorus of Sicily, It was at exactly this moment Marcus Furius Camillus arrived with a relief army. He defiantly threw his own sword onto the scales and declared, "Non oro sed ferro recuperanda est patria." We defend Rome not with gold, but with iron. He then attacked the Gauls and drove them out of the city. These traditional recantings of the Senones War are likely the result of Roman propaganda. Livy and Diodorus authored their accounts centuries after the sack happened, and were probably trying to salvage some honour out of a particularly dark chapter of Roman history. In particular, Camillus's last-minute heroics were likely a complete fabrication. Simply put, the true summary of the events is probably as follows. The Gauls crushed the Romans, looted their city, blockaded the Capitoline Hill, got paid, and went home. This simplistic take is plausible because the Gauls were a simple war party that probably sought nothing other than to obtain plunder and return to their families. It would take a generation for Rome to recover from the devastation brought upon it by the Senones, while conversely, Gallic influence in Italy grew ever stronger. Throughout the 4th and early 3rd centuries BC, Celtic war parties regularly plundered into the Roman hinterlands, while Gaulish mercenary groups became a staple contingent of many anti-Roman factions, such as the Greek tyrants of Sicily and a certain up-and-coming Carthaginian thalassocracy. Rome would not be the only classical civilization the Gauls would make war on. Let us now shift our focus eastwards to the land of philosophers and hoplites and talk about the Celtic invasions of the ancient Greek world. Gallic war parties had entered the northern Balkan peninsula in the early 4th century BC, where they would spend the next century in sporadic warfare with the Illyrians, Thracians, Paeonians, and other local native peoples. According to the Greek historian Strabo, in 335 BC, a certain Alexander, yes, that Alexander, was encamped along the Danube River, fresh from his victories in his campaign to subdue the Illyrian tribes. There, he received an envoy of foreign barbarians, tall, muscular Gauls, who had come to seek the Macedonian king's friendship, for they respected his prowess as a leader of warriors. As the story goes, Alexander asked the Gauls what they feared most, expecting that they would hold him in such awe that they would say Alexander himself. Instead, the Gauls haughtily replied that they feared only that the sky would fall on their heads. Nevertheless, the Celts were always ready to respect a worthy warrior, and showed great admiration for the Macedonian king, daring not to invade Greece while he ruled. Alexander would go on to conquer most of the known world, only to die prematurely in Babylon, and as his former territories became divided by infighting among his former generals, the rich land of Hellas entered the crosshairs of Gallic warlords looking for easy plunder. In 298 BC, the Gallic chieftain Cymboles led a war party that pillaged its way through Thrace and Macedon, only to be stopped in its tracks by the army of the Diadochi king Cassander on the slopes of Mount Haemus. Nevertheless, during this expedition, the Gallic Serdi established a foothold in Thrace, founding the settlement of Serdica on the site of modern-day Sofia. The next Celtic wave would arrive in 281 BC, when a horde of 85,000 men, mostly of the Boii and Volcae tribes, split into 3 contingents and simultaneously invaded Paeonia, the rest of Thrace, and Macedon. During this expedition, a war chief known as Bolgios faced down the army of Ptolemy Kyrinos, the current king of Macedon and the son of the founder of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. In the battle that followed, the Macedonian king himself was thrown from his war elephant and hacked to pieces by Gallic warriors. These initial successes increased the appetite for further incursions into Greece, and a year later, a chieftain known as Brenos began calling for another southwards expedition. According to legend, Brenos called for an assembly of Gallic chieftains and presented before them a group of Greek captives who were weak in body. He juxtaposed them with his finest, most well-built warriors, using this as proof that the Greeks were a weak people compared to the Gauls, and could be easily overrun. By 279 BC, Brenos had successfully assembled a massive tribal coalition. Ancient sources claim that his army amounted to a mind-boggling 150,000 warriors, but modern estimates give us a more realistic figure of 50,000. Brenos pillaged through undefended northern Greece unimpeded. Some stories claim that, when questioned on the sacrilegious nature of looting the temples, Brenos pithily remarked, "The gods, being rich, ought to be generous to men." As is par for the course, the story of the Gallic invasion of Greece survives almost exclusively through the writings of Greco-Roman authors. In this case, in the works of Pausanias, a Greek geographer living in a Roman-ruled Anatolia during the 2nd century AD. As it was with Livy and his account of the sack of Rome, Pausanias lived nearly 400 years after the events he was describing, and is prone to various anachronisms and biases, especially in describing the ostensibly savage and barbarian Celtic invaders. Nevertheless, to maintain a straightforward narrative, our interpretation of Brenos's campaign will anchor itself to Pausanias' version of events. Brenos's horde seems to have met little to no resistance as they ravaged their way throughout the region of Thessaly, where no army large enough to stop them could be mustered. Indeed, it is likely that some Thessalians even joined the Gallic horde, either through coercion or of their own free will, hoping that by attaching themselves to the Gauls, they might themselves become rich through loot and pillage at the expense of their fellow Greeks. Indeed, the Greeks were an endemically disunited lot, with the Hellenic kingdoms of Macedonia and the Near East, and the city-states of southern Hellas always bickering and warring. Brenos was most likely fully aware of this, and assumed that incorrigible Greek infighting would prevent any united defense force large enough to oppose him from forming. This assumption would prove to be erroneous, as a massive horde of barbarian marauders set the Macedonian and Thessalian countryside ablaze. The Greek city-states around the Malian Gulf began to feel the heat. Thus, in an act of uncharacteristic cooperation, a defensive alliance was formed, a political miracle likely achieved by the Athenian statesman Demochares. According to Pausanias, this alliance consisted of the following: 10,000 fully armoured heavy hoplites and 500 cavalry from Boeotia, 3,000 lightly armed footmen and 500 cavalry from Phocis, 700 footmen from Locris, 400 hoplites from Megara, and 7,000 hoplites and 800 light footmen from Aetolia. Athens' contribution to the ground forces, consisting of 1,000 hoplites and 500 cavalry, was relatively small, but they also deployed a large squadron of trireme warships to the war effort. As the Gauls finished stripping Thessaly bare of its riches and began moving south, the Greek allies moved into position, deciding to stop the Gallic advance at none other than the narrow pass of Thermopylae. Stop us if you've heard this one before. Soon the allies had encamped in the pass, where King Leonidas had made his last stand against the Persians over 200 years earlier. There, the Greeks learned that Brenos's host was already in the neighbourhood of Phthiotis, so they dispatched their cavalry and 1,000 light infantry to destroy all bridges across the Spercheios River in an attempt to delay the Gallic advance. This would not be effective, for Brenos was, as Pausanias begrudgingly put it, not utterly stupid nor inexperienced for a barbarian in devising tricks of strategy. As a counterplay, the war chief picked out the best swimmers among his horde and deployed them to sections of the Spercheios which took the form of wide and shallow marshes. Here the chieftain's hand-picked Gauls forded the river, amusingly using their large oak wood shields as pool floaties, paddleboarding across the water. Where a Greek hoplite in full metal panoply would have had trouble making this aquatic crossing, the lightly armoured Celts suffered no difficulties doing so. Upon hearing that a vanguard of Gauls had made it onto their side of the river, the Greek advance force retreated back to Thermopylae rather than engaging. Thereafter, Brenos had the local population of the Malian Gulf rounded up and forced them to rebuild bridges over the Spercheios so the rest of his army could cross. The Malians took to this task feverishly, terrified of Brenos and eager to get him and his destructive barbarians out of their territory so they could go pillage elsewhere. After crossing the Spercheios, the Gauls entered the hinterlands outside the city of Heraclea in Trachis, which they plundered. However, they did not stay there long, for Brennus had now directed his full efforts into driving away the army which opposed him. On one fateful day, as the sun rose over the Thermopylae Pass, the Greeks saw a horde of spiky-haired, mustachioed muscle men crest over the horizon. The Hellenes formed up, heavily armoured hoplites forming into a tight phalanx as they blocked the pass and waited for the coming charge, and thus the battle was joined. Pausanias' account of the initial Gallic assault begins with the cornerstone of Celtic warfare, a deafening, blood-curdling charge. With reckless abandon, tens of thousands of Gauls barreled toward the Greek line, hurling their javelins into the phalanx, then crashing into their foe in a tidal wave of bare-chested fury. However, the enemy they faced was not the disorganized rabble of an infantile Roman Republic, but professional, disciplined men. Against the onslaught, the Greek phalanx held firm, their shields locked and spears bristling. The melee was brutal, with the Gauls struggling like madmen to break the hoplite shield wall. Pierced by arrow or javelin, they did not abate of their passion so long as life remained. Some drew out from their wounds the spears by which they had been hit and threw them at the Greeks or used them in close fighting. But no matter how ferociously they hacked away at it, and the heavily armoured Greeks could easily cut down their lightly armoured counterparts. Although both sides had cavalry, neither could use them, for the bottleneck made flanking maneuvers impossible. Meanwhile, the Hellenic light infantry hurled javelins, slung rocks, and shot arrows at the Gallic horde from behind the front lines, further thinning out their numbers. All while the Athenian navy brought their ships as close to the shore as possible, and from the decks of their triremes, raked the Gauls with arrows and every other kind of missile. Just as it had been for the Persians 3 centuries earlier, for the Gauls, the pass of Thermopylae had become a killing field. After a day of fighting, Brennus had no choice but to concede that the Greek alliance would not be dislodged from their position, and ordered the retreat. This withdrawal was not orderly, with the Gauls routing in a panic. Many crushed beneath the feet of their friends, and many others fell into the swamp and disappeared under the mud. Ultimately, the Battle of Thermopylae was a decisive victory for the Greeks, with thousands of Gauls lying dead and minimal casualties on the Hellenic end. However, this victory had not ended the Gallic threat for good, for while Brennus had lost a significant chunk of his fighting force and his men were thoroughly demoralized, he was not ready to pack up and go home. Knowing now that he would not be able to surmount his foe while they remained united and entrenched in a choke point, Brennus devised a plan to break up the Greek alliance. He dispatched a large contingent of footmen and cavalry under the command of 2 chieftains, Orestius and Combutis, to make for the nearby region of Aetolia and put it to fire and sword. They did this, crossing the bridges on the Spercheios, whereupon they cut through Thessaly and descended upon the Aetolian city of Callium, subjecting it to a brutal sack, a scene Pausanias describes viscerally. The fate of the Callians at the hands of Combutis and Orestius is the most wicked ever heard of, and is without a parallel in the crimes of men. Every male they put to the sword, and there were butchered old men equally with children at their mothers' breasts. The more plump of these sucking babes the Gauls killed, drinking their blood and eating their flesh. This brutality's intended purpose worked, for it compelled the Aetolian contingent at Thermopylae to break camp and rush to defend their homes. Still, it also stirred up a hornet's nest, which would descend upon the Gauls in a swarm. Horrified and outraged by the fate of Callium, the rest of Aetolia's cities began mustering up impromptu militias, with women taking up arms alongside their men, driven by righteous fury to repel the invaders. Realizing that the Gallic sword was only dangerous at close quarters, the Aetolians resorted to skirmishing tactics. At a place called Corcalia, they ambushed the Gallic column, raining javelins, slings and arrows upon the Gauls, who were shredded due to their lack of armor, protected by nothing but their national shields. Over half of Orestius and Combutis' raiding party was slaughtered, with the rest limping back to rejoin Brennus at Thermopylae. Meanwhile, Brennus had made a play to flank the Greek blockade, having intimidated some locals into revealing a path through Mount Oeta, which would allow him to sneak around the Greeks at Thermopylae and attack them from the rear. In fact, this was the same pass that Ephialtes of Trachis had revealed to the Persians when he betrayed King Leonidas 300 years earlier. At the head of around half of his army, Brennus proceeded over the mountain road, leaving the other half of his forces in command of a man named Achicorius, who he commanded to attack once the enveloping movement was complete. Having learned from the defeat of their ancestors at Persian hands, this time the Greeks had left this secret hill passage guarded by the Phocian hoplites. Although the Phocians fought bravely to deny Brennus thoroughfare, they were eventually overwhelmed and forced to retreat, but not before they managed to send runners to the Greek army informing them about what was happening. Knowing they were about to be pincered, the Greeks withdrew, boarding upon the Athenian warships and sailing off to safety before they could be surrounded and slaughtered by the Gauls. Following this, Brennos made a final gambit, rearing his army eastwards for the sacred oracle of Delphi, hoping that seizing the riches of Apollo's temple would salvage the expedition. Here, the united Greek force reconstituted itself and made a final stand. The Gauls were crushed, losing over 16,000 men in the battle and the ensuing retreat. In the eyes of the Greeks, it was a victory delivered by Apollo himself, who saw fit to punish the temple-defiling barbarians. Most of the surviving Celts retreated back to Thrace, while a completely dishonored Brennus committed suicide. The Gallic invasion of Greece was a failure, but it had one significant consequence. Before the march on Delphi, a contingent of the Gallic horde, composed mainly of warriors from the Tectosages, Trochmii, and Telistobokii tribes, had peeled off from the main invasion force and crossed the Dardanelles into Anatolia. Unlike Brennos's main force, which had come to Greece to raid and plunder, this group had come to settle. They built forts on the rugged hills of central Anatolia and established permanence for themselves in the region by serving as mercenary shock troops in the many wars being fought in the region between various Hellenic rulers. The region of Asia Minor these Gauls inhabited became known as Galatia, and the people who lived in it the Galatians. Remarkably, even though they were surrounded by foreign peoples and isolated from the rest of the Gallic world, there is evidence that the Galatians of Anatolia retained their Celtic language and culture as late as the 6th century AD. In 279 BC, the Celtic world was at its greatest extent. Spread out over a massive territory that overlapped the borders of modern nations as diverse as Ukraine, Czechia, Austria, Switzerland, Bulgaria, Turkey, Italy, France, Britain, Portugal, and Spain. This was the golden age of the Celts, but like all golden ages, it was not to last. Brennus's defeat in Greece had proven something important. A well-trained, well-armed professional army, fighting as a single, disciplined body, was fully capable of resisting the howling terror of the Gallic horde. This was a stark reality that the Gauls would soon learn well, as back in Italy, a certain Latin republic was on the mend and ready to take her revenge upon the barbarians who had once laid her so low. After winning the Second Samnite War, the Roman Republic had expanded its territory and become the hegemons of central Italy. In 298 BC, the Third Samnite War began, with the Etruscans, the Samnites, and the Gallic Senones tribe all trying to curb the growing power of Rome. The Senones had been the terror of the Republic since they sacked Rome 2 generations earlier, and in 295 they massacred a Roman army outside the Etruscan city of Clusium, with Livy claiming that the heads of the legionnaires were mounted on the Gallic spears as they sang their triumphant war songs. Yet the tides turned later that year, when the Senones and their Samnite allies clashed with the Romans outside Centium, where they were crushed. Taking advantage of their victory in the Third Samnite War, the Romans pushed north, conquering the lands of the Senones by 283 BC, where they established a military colony called Sena Gallica. The sack of Rome had finally been avenged. This was a critical junction in the Gallo-Roman story, for the Gallic illusion of invincibility had begun to dim. But what had changed since the sack of Rome to allow the armies of the Republic to finally be able to go toe-to-toe against the most terrifying warriors in the ancient world? After being humbled by their Italic cousins during the beginning of the Second Samnite War in 315 BC, the Romans realized that the phalanx they had inherited from the Etruscans and Greeks was not a versatile fighting formation, especially on uneven terrain, or against a particularly malleable foe. With the goal of developing a more dynamic standing army, they created the innovative Manipula system. Under this system, the standard Roman legions were organized into 3 rows, each one comprised of a checkerboard-like pattern of titular maniples, a basic unit of soldiers containing 120 heads. Compared to a phalanx, which consisted of single, conjoined rows of men, the dynamic maniples were able to maneuver about more effectively by virtue of being separate units. The Manipula legions were organized into 3 standard rows. The front lines were made up of Hastati, fresh recruits. Behind them were the Principes, who were battle-hardened soldiers. Finally, the back row was made up of Triarii, the most veteran elites, and the last resort in battle. Originally manufactured to battle the mounted Samnites, the Manipula system soon proved effective against the Celts. As you will recall, Gallic warfare revolved around using fear tactics to plummet enemy morale before utilizing a single ferocious charge aimed to break their lines. This had worked in 390 BC, but the new maniples were far better equipped to weather the Gallic onslaught. Their 3-line reserve system meant that no single charge could rout a Roman legion, as even if the front line of Hastati broke, there were fresh, experienced Principes and Triarii to replace them. Moreover, the general maneuverability of the Manipula legions allowed them to counter the effectiveness of more mobile Gallic units, like the war chariot. It should, however, be noted that these innovations did not make the Romans invulnerable to Gallic warfare. As the protracted, centuries-long invasion of the Celtic world continued, many tribes would adopt styles of battle better suited for countering the professional Roman war machine, scoring many victories that delayed the imperial advance into Gaulish lands. In the decades after their conquest of the Senones' territory, Rome would become entangled in several other wars, first locking horns with Pyrrhus and his lumbering war elephants, then with Carthage for the first time. By the end of these wars, Rome had become the undisputed master of Peninsula Italy, and the way into the Celtic lands of the Po Valley was now open. The primary trigger for the next great Celtic war came in 232, when tribune Gaius Flaminius, who would later die in battle against Hannibal at Lake Trasimene, proposed a bill that would distribute land in former Senone lands in Picenium between the Roman colonists. This proposal was incredibly popular among many segments of the population, but many others fiercely resisted it, fearing the barbarians' reaction. They were right to be anxious. Many of the Celtic tribes, observing this blatant repopulation of lands which had so recently belonged to their own kinsmen, became convinced that Rome was now waging war against them not simply for sovereignty and supremacy, but for the purpose of their complete annihilation or expulsion. Not willing to go gently into that good night, 2 of the largest Italian Celtic tribes, the Insubres and the Boii, concluded a strong alliance, and then sent representatives into Gaul. They eventually reached the territories of a combative group of Celts living in the Rhone Valley known as the Gasati, fearsome, profit-minded warriors who frequently sold their violent services to the highest bidder as mercenaries. Upon reaching the Gasati lands, the Italo-Celtic ambassadors received an audience with the local twin kings, Concolitanus and Aneroestus, speaking of Italy's vast wealth, and pointing out just how much treasure could be hauled back if they crushed the Romans and put the peninsula at their mercy. Persuaded by the merits of this mercenary argument, the Gasati began mustering a truly massive and well-equipped army, drawn from their own lands and from Celtic tribes all over Western Europe. As this was happening in the north, the Carthaginian Empire took another step towards the Second Punic War by conquering most of Hispania, a process made considerably easier by the movement of so many Celtiberians to join the two kings' rapidly growing invasion army. Suddenly beset by threats on each flank, Rome renewed its previous treaty with the Barcids of Spain in order to fully concentrate its resources on the impending Celtic invasion. The storm finally hit in 1225 BC, when the plunder-hungry 50,000-strong Gauls-led horde crossed the Alps and joined their brethren in Italy. Rome responded militarily by sending Consul Lucius Aemilius Pappus with a 40,000-strong army to Ariminum, where he awaited the Celtic onslaught. In a flurry of activity, messengers were sent from Rome in all directions. One went to Sardinia, recalling the Republic's second consul of 225, Gaius Atilius Regulus, who had been quelling a revolt there at the time. Other hurried emissaries reached the courts of the Gauls' rival tribes, including those of the Veneti and Cenomanni, who, upon receiving the Republic's offer, turned against their Gallic brethren and threatened to invade their lands. This forced the invading coalition to split its forces, leaving part of it in the Po Valley to defend against a possible Veneti invasion. Even in these early days, Rome's diplomatic lethality was one of its sharpest weapons. The Gesati, Insubres, Boii, and other tribes assaulted Etruria as one, overwhelming the small defensive army there and ravaging its hard-gained wealth. Meeting little opposition, the barbarian horde began a march which must have invoked the darkest nightmares of every Republican citizen, directly on Rome itself. However, upon reaching Clusium, a scant 3 days' travel from the sacred capital itself, the Celts received reports that another 40,000-strong Roman allied army of Sabines and Etruscans was tailing them. Turning to meet the threat, the twin kings came into close proximity of their enemy at dusk, before encamping for the night. At this point, the uncivilized barbarians used a wily trick. After lighting all of their fires, the Celtic cavalry was ordered to remain in camp until daylight rendered them visible. However, the foot soldiers withdrew to a nearby town called Faesulae, where they hid in ambush, constructing a field of traps along the path where they expected Rome's legions to march. An attentive viewer might be surprised to hear the name Faesulae, as the distance between modern Faesulae, Fiesole, and modern Clusium, Chiusi, is more than 120 kilometers, making this retreat in such a short time impossible. So some modern authors suggest that there was another, lesser-known Faesulae closer to Clusium. When morning came, the unknown praetor observed an apparently vulnerable, exposed formation of mounted enemy troops. Anticipating an easy victory, he began pursuing the Celtic horsemen, who rode away towards Faesulae at his advance. Unfortunately for him, the Roman legions were struck by surprise upon passing the booby-trapped area, and after a fierce fight, were destroyed, with 6,000 dead. The surviving Roman forces retreated to safety on a nearby fortified hill, but were surrounded and besieged there by the Celts. However, exhausted by the nighttime exertion and desiring rest, the victorious attackers left a cavalry detachment to keep watch over the hill before retiring for the night. If the outmatched Romans did not surrender by daybreak, they would be attacked. During the dark hours, however, Lucius Aemilius's consular army arrived in the area, having received word of the invasion of Etruria while he was stationed at Ariminum. After constructing his own camp in visible range of both the Celts and the desperate Roman army remnant, the consul quickly received messengers from the latter, informing him of the situation. Therefore, Aemilius had his military tribunes arrange his infantry in battle formation at daybreak, while he personally led his cavalry towards the Roman-held hill, at once realizing that the two enemy forces collectively came close to rivaling their own strength. King Aeneas advised retreat back home, as to not risk all of the gathered loot. Concurring with their chief, the Celtic army began withdrawing north along the western coast of Italy. As they did, Emilius joined the survivors of the Faeciulae disaster to his own army, and began following the barbarians, declining any pitched battle in favour of constant harassment of the enemy rear, and catching isolated foraging parties when the opportunity arose. As the leisurely Gaulish retreat north continued, Emilius's consular colleague, Regulus, arrived in Italy from Sardinia by sea and reached the city of Pisa. He was now directly in the path of the marauding invaders, but didn't know it yet. Marching briskly in the direction of Rome, Regulus and his 40,000 encountered and defeated a small advance unit of foragers near Cape Telamon and took a few prisoners. Upon interrogation, these barbarian captives revealed details of everything that had occurred, as well as the current situation. The main Celtic army was nearby and approaching fast, with Emilius biting at their heels. After initial surprise at the foe's close proximity, Regulus was overjoyed at the strategic situation, with himself blocking the road of retreat and his colleague to the enemy's immediate south. There was a very real opportunity for total victory. After concluding the interrogation, probably resulting in many dead Celts, Regulus drew up the infantry of his citizen legions into a standard battle formation: Velite skirmishers up front, Hastati new bloods in the first line, seasoned Principes in the second, and grizzled Triarii veterans in reserve. As the legionaries began marching down the Telamon road, in a typically disciplined Roman style, Regulus personally led the mounted equites to occupy a strategically placed hill just off the path, rushing the effort because of his eagerness to secure the position before the Gaulish and their allies arrived. In the fog of war, the approaching Celts were unaware of Regulus's army in front of them, and upon seeing the cavalry seizing the hill in front of them, believed the horsemen were actually units of Emilius, who had managed to slip around during the night. To regain the hill from this apparently isolated force, the two Celtic kings sent their own cavalry and some light infantry to lock the landmark down, but faced suspiciously more resistance than they initially expected. Nevertheless, they slowly gained ground. After a short time, a Roman soldier was captured and taken to the Gaulish leadership, revealing the presence of Regulus's second consular army not far away, suddenly realizing the dire truth of affairs, that they were about to be crushed between two Roman armies, one on each side. The Celtic leadership deployed for battle in an unconventional two-line formation. One line, consisting of fearsome, fully naked Gaulish warriors and the powerful Insubres, faced south, while the other, made up of Taurisci and Boii units, faced north. Wagons and chariots were on either wing. Upon witnessing this peculiar deployment, Emilius instantly realized that his consular brother must have been nearby and set out to assist him. To do that, he drew up his own legions to face the Celtic infantry, while what cavalry he had left rode to assist his colleague on the hill, further intensifying the struggle there. As the Romans slowly began to turn the tables on their Celtic opponents in the struggle for the hill, Consul Regulus was slain in the melee, last seen fighting with bravery and courage. Although his head was cut off and taken to the two kings as a symbolic prize, it was not enough. Soon the reinforced Roman equites threw the Celtic cavalry into a rout, secured the hill, and a strategic victory along with it. As soon as this happened, the legionary vice slowly began to snap shut, as Roman infantry in checkerboard formation advanced on the two-face battle array of the Celts from both sides. As they came closer, a cacophony of terrifying war cries, deep trumpets and horn blowers made vast amounts of noise in hopes of unnerving the Republic's soldiers, but still they advanced. When the velites of both Roman armies got into missile range, they unleashed a terrible storm of light javelins upon the cornered Celts. While the north-facing front rank, composed of Taurisci, wearing light armor, cloak, and donning a shield, were able to resist the steel storm, the naked south-facing Gaulish immediately started suffering terribly. Because the Celtic shield failed to cover a warrior's entire body, many of the velites' missiles got through the gaps, striking exposed parts of the body, such as legs, and causing terrible wounds when they did. The larger and more physically imposing a Gauls warrior was, the more chance a javelin had of striking them from a distance. Unable to effectively countercharge due to the distance and the relentless rain of iron from the sky, some of the naked warriors suicidally charged towards the enemy ranks, most being floored by ranged weapons after only a short time, while others reached the Roman light troops before falling. Having been scythed apart before the true legions had even been engaged, the battered Geissati withdrew behind their comparatively well-armoured Insubre comrades. At this moment, both sets of Roman Hastati advanced, each throwing their lethal pilum javelins before drawing a fearsome thrusting sword. The battle was initially an event contest, Celtic bravery, physical fortitude and prowess in combat, going up against the notoriously lash-laden discipline of Rome's world-conquering legions. Unable to break the Insubres, Boii and Taurisci, who were so valiantly fighting for their homes as well as profit, the Hastati withdrew and allowed the more experienced Principes to advance. This impact gradually ground the stalwart Celtic line to dust, but they still did not break. As Polybius relates, though being almost cut to pieces, they held their ground, equal to their foes in courage and inferior only as a force and individually in their arms. However valiant their resistance, the victory of Telamon was crowned when Aemilius's victorious cavalry charged down the hill and crashed headlong into the exhausted Celtic line. There was no contest, but the barbarian warriors on foot chose to die where they stood rather than fleeing, while the cavalry had no such compunction. 40,000 Celts were massacred at Telamon in what was probably one of the greatest battles fought upon Italian soil up until that point. A further 10,000 defeated barbarians entered Roman captivity, including their king Concoletanus, who was left alive in preparation for a triumph. As a reward for his legionaries, the consul marched north and invaded Boii lands in the Po Valley, allowing the troops free rein to pillage, loot and burn. With that done, he returned to Rome a hero and celebrated a gilded triumph, in which Concoletanus was the star exhibit. The defeat at Telamon shows us another disadvantage that hamstrung the Gauls: disunity. Celtic leaders systematically prioritized the needs of their own tribe, and even when different tribes worked together, it was always a temporary measure. Before the campaign, the Romans had paid off the Boii tribe's rivals, the Cenomani and Veneti, to invade Boii lands, forcing the Boii to keep a significant portion of their warriors north to defend their borders, rather than bring the full brunt of their army down upon Rome. Celtic disunity also played a major role in the disparity in the quality of equipment between the Roman and Gallic warriors. As we covered in the last chapter, the Celts were incredibly skilled metallurgists, but their fragmented tribal society prevented them from pooling their resources together to arm everyone equally. Rome, on the other hand, was a single, united polity with advanced infrastructure and central administration, able to churn out professional legions equipped with standardized gear. After their victory at Telamon, the Romans pushed deep into the Celtic Alps, occupying much of northern Italy. Not that they would be able to savor the sweetness of victory long, for only a few years later, round 2 would erupt between the Republic and Carthage, which this time was led by Hannibal Barca. In one of the most iconic military maneuvers in history, Hannibal aimed to surprise the Romans by marching through the treacherous Alps. There he was hailed as a liberator by the Boii and Insubres, who joined the Carthaginian army en masse. However, some tribes, like the Cenomani, declared their loyalty to Rome, and thus had to be defeated by Hannibal's forces. Nevertheless, at the Battle of Cannae, where 30,000 Romans were slaughtered, much of the Carthaginian army was composed of Gallic mercenaries, as well as Celtiberians, who we will get to later. Since we all know how Hannibal's story ends, let's fast forward a little bit. As Rome emerged out of the Second Punic War, bloodied but victorious, They shifted their attention back northwards, where the Boii and Insubres continued to resist Roman expansion. Even the Cenomani, who had benefited little from their friendship with Rome, turned against their former allies. Nevertheless, Rome had put down these insurrections by 191 BC and finally conquered all the Gauls of northern Italy. Now let us move westward and explore a lesser-known theatre in which the Roman eagle clashed with the Celtic boarhead. Since the dawn of recorded history, the Iberian Peninsula had been a highly cosmopolitan land. By the 3rd century BC, it was home to a variety of Celts and non-Celtic peoples like the Lusitanians, Turdetani, Aquitani, and Iberians, whose languages and cultures probably predated the arrival of the Celts in the region. The Celtiberians, who lived in northwestern Spain, were a divergent Celtic culture probably created from intermixing between Celtic migrants and the native Iberians. They spoke a Celtic language that was very different from the Gaulish languages of the rest of continental Europe. However, it should be noted that Iberia was also home to various Celtic-speaking communities whose material culture was more in line with the mainstream Latin complex seen throughout the rest of Europe. Much like in Italy, the story of the Celts in Iberia is tied to the eternal struggle between Rome and Carthage. The North African Empire had colonies along the peninsula's south coast for centuries, but during the interbellum between the First and Second Punic Wars, Hamilcar Barca and his son Hannibal had pushed deep inland. Celtiberian tribes like the Capitani put up fierce resistance, but were soon subdued. Iberia would consequently become one of the most crucial theatres of the Second Punic War. After Rome emerged bloodied but victorious in their epochal struggle against Hannibal Barca, they replaced Carthage as the new foreign overlord of southern and eastern Iberia, which they divided into two regions, Hispania Caetiria, nearer Spain, and Hispania Ulteria, further Spain. It did not take long before the proud native peoples of the peninsula began rising up in defiance against the Roman eagle. It bears mentioning that, as with every other Celtic war we have covered so far, the story of the Republic's conquest of Iberia comes nearly exclusively from Roman sources, in this case mainly the aforementioned Livy and the Alexandrian historian Appian. As such, the following tale comes with the usual disclaimers that one must provide when using culturally biased writers living several generations after the events they write about to piece together ancient history. Among the first native peoples in Hispania to rebel against Rome were the Turdetani, a non-Celtic indigenous people living in the modern Andalusia region. The Turdetani hired over 10,000 Celtiberian sellswords who lived adjacent to their lands to boost their numbers. Indeed, mercenary work was a profession for which the Celtiberians had made themselves famous during the Punic Wars. Before long, huge revolts had spread like wildfire across both Hispania Caetiria and Ulteria, with the Iberians of the east coast rising up as well. Several victories were won against the Roman garrisons in the region, and the governor of Caetiria, Gaius Sempronius Tuditanus, was slain in battle. When word of the severity of these uprisings reached Rome, the Senate responded by appointing the iron-fisted consul Marcus Porcius Cato to bring the quarrelsome natives to heel. At the head of an army consisting of 2 Roman legions, 15,000 Latin allies, 800 cavalry, and 20 warships, Cato made landfall in the Gulf of Roses in 195 BC. The consul quickly secured a foothold in the land of the indigenous Iberians. Establishing a base of operations in the Greek city of Emporion, he used a shrewd mix of diplomacy and psychological warfare to secure the loyalty and submission of some Iberian tribes, like the Iligetes, while crushing openly rebellious tribes like the Indigetes. Within months, Cato had re-established Roman control over the east coast of Spain, and then proceeded south to subdue the Turdetani. To that end, he allegedly offered the Celtiberian mercenaries among the Turdetani a huge bribe to have them stand down, which they did. Now fully isolated, the lands of the Turdetani were overrun. For the Celtiberians, the short-sighted decision to take Roman gold would cost them. Having put down the rebellions of the Iberians and Turdetani, Cato now turned upon them. Marching his army northwards, he successfully besieged and captured the fortified hill town of Sigontia, the centre power of the Celtiberian Aravaki tribe. Cato proceeded up the Ebro River, the heartland of Celtiberian territory, forcing the other tribes in the area to tear down the walls of their hill forts and submit to the authority of Rome. During his time in Hispania, Marcus Porcius Cato claimed to have destroyed more cities than he had spent days in Hispania, having put over 300 native settlements to the sword. His suppression of the first wave of anti-Roman rebellions on the peninsula was brutal. It ensured that the young republic's presence in the region would be permanent. Still, it did not, by a long shot, put a permanent end to the endemic resistance against Roman rule. In 194 BC, Cato was called back to Rome and replaced by his political rival Publius Cornelius Scipio, who took the position of Praetor of Hispania Ulteria. Scipio picked up where Cato left off, locking horns with the quasi-Celtic Lusitani tribes along the border of Hispania Ulteria and defeating them in battle near Alippa near modern-day Seville. Meanwhile, Marcus Fulvius Nobilior, the Praetor of Hispania Citeria, had launched a campaign deeper into Celtiberian lands, ingressing into the territory of the Capitani, the tribe which once put up a valiant resistance against the Barcids of Carthage. In response to this invasion, the local tribes rallied around a leader, who Livy identifies as Heleno and gives the title of Rex. Forging together an anti-Roman coalition consisting of the Capitani, Vatones, Vicae, and Celtiberi tribes, Heleno brought the fight to the Romans. Still, his warriors were defeated by Nobilior outside the fortress town of Toletum, and he himself was captured alive. After this, most Celtiberian tribes submitted to Rome nominally, but sporadic revolts and opportunistic raiding never fully ceased. Full-scale conflict would erupt again in 181 BC, when a Roman plan to transplant thousands of Italian settlers into Hispania caused a surge of resentment among the Celtiberians, provoking a massive uprising which historians today call the First Celtiberian War, the first of 3 such conflicts. Although Livy provides scant details about the coalition that rose up to oppose the Republic, neglecting to list which specific tribes took up arms, or even the names of their leaders, he does emphatically state that they mustered as many as 35,000 men, the largest force the Celtiberians had ever raised to fight Rome. At the time, the acting praetor of Hispania Citeria was Quintus Fulvius Flaccus, who had only around 10,000 troops at his disposal, consisting of 3,000 Roman legionnaires, 6,000 Latin allies, and 500 cavalry. Levying troops from the local tribes friendly to Rome, he received an additional 6,000 native auxiliaries. Still, his forces were less than half that of the Celtiberian alliance which opposed him. Nevertheless, Flaccus doggedly pursued the initiative, marching his army into the territory of the Capitani and occupying the town of Ibura with little difficulty, bivouacking the majority of his army just outside its limits. A few days later, the Celtiberian host appeared on the horizon, setting up a fortified camp on a hill 2 miles from the town. Flaccus ordered his cavalry to scout out the size and fortifications of the enemy stockade, but to retreat if engaged by the enemy's cavalry. This was accomplished without incident, and for a few days nothing happened. Then, after a prolonged standoff, the Celtiberians advanced out from their camp and formed a battle line, challenging the Romans to fight. Flaccus ordered his men to remain in their camp. Over the next 4 days, the Spaniards sallied out of their camp repeatedly, but the Romans never responded. After a while, the natives gave up on trying to goad their foe into battle. Both sides settled into a docile routine, regularly sending out their cavalry to scout the opposition, but never interfering with one another. By turtling up in his camp, Flaccus lulled the Celtiberians into complacency, by making them think they should not expect action soon. Once he was confident he had done this, he sprung his trap. Under cover of nightfall, he ordered his subordinate, Lucius Acilius, to take a contingent of cavalry and 6,000 native auxiliaries to make a circuit around the mountain which lay behind the enemy camp and approach it from the rear.
From there, they laid in wait like a snake in the grass. To trigger the trap, Achilles sent a contingent of his cavalry to ride out in front of the enemy camp and challenge them to do battle. When the Celtiberians saw these horsemen before them, they immediately engaged, first sending out their cavalry to chase them down, followed by infantry who formed a battle line and joined in the pursuit. Achilles ordered his men to retreat, drawing most of the Celtiberian force as far away from their camp as possible. Once the Spaniards were half a mile out from their camp, Flaccus ordered the bulk of his army to engage, advancing upon the approaching enemy in 3 separate corps. Meanwhile, Achilles' forces on the hill charged down into the Celtiberian stockade, where only 5,000 men had been left on guard. The ambush caught them completely by surprise, and the Roman equestrians were able to take the camp with little resistance before putting it to the torch. When the Celtiberians saw their stockade go up in flames, panic and dismay spread among them. Knowing they were now effectively trapped with nowhere to retreat to, their confidence crumbled. Nevertheless, as Livy admits, they resolved to fight to the end. The Celtiberians crashed into the Roman lines with reckless abandon, and fought with such fury that it seemed they might break through Flaccus's lines for a time. However, before long, the Romans were reinforced by the soldiers garrisoning Ibera and Achilles' contingent, which smashed into the Spaniards from the flank and the rear respectively. Now surrounded, the battle became a slaughter. Over 20,000 Celtiberian rebels died, while at least, according to Livy, Roman casualties were minimal. Through their victory at Ibera, the Romans dealt a mortal blow to the Celtiberian insurrection, but it still took another 2 years to stamp it out entirely. In 180, Flaccus's forces were ambushed in the Manlian Pass, and although they were able to fight off their assailants, they sustained heavy casualties in the process. In 179 BC, Flaccus was replaced by Sempronius Gracchus as governor of Hispania Caetiria. Gracchus subsequently spent the first year of his tenure grinding his way through the territory of the Vacii and Celtiberi, where he was said to have destroyed over 300 native fortresses. Gracchus adopted a policy of aggressive Romanization in the Ebro River Valley, ordering the construction of Roman towns on tribal land, and encouraging Celtiberian warriors to enlist in the Roman army. Moreover, he made most native tribes sign treaties which forbade them from building new fortified settlements, while taking members of their nobility back to Rome as hostages. Through these measures, Gracchus was convinced that he had prevented any further rebellions from happening in the future. He was wrong. In 155, the Lusitanians and the Vitones initiated a war with the Romans in Hispania Ulteria. Perhaps taking advantage of this distraction, the Celtiberian Belli tribe stopped paying tribute to Rome, and defiantly began building a 7-kilometer-long circuit of walls around their stronghold of Segeda, while convincing neighbouring tribes like the Titi to move into the area. By doing this, they aimed to turn Segeda into a nucleus of Celtiberian resistance against Roman rule. The Republican Senate was very aware of this, but when they protested that the denizens of Segeda were violating the treaty they had made with Sempronius Gracchus 2 decades earlier, the Celtiberians within pithily retorted that the treaty had forbidden them from building new forts, not fortifying pre-existing towns. Naturally, the Romans would not stomach such insolence, and the Second Celtiberian War began. The consul the Senate chose to put down this newest Spanish insurrection was Quintus Fabius Nobilior, who arrived in Hispania in early spring at the head of a 30,000-strong army. Upon arriving at Segeda, Nobilior found the city abandoned, for the inhabitants had known they would not finish building the walls before the Romans arrived. They had retreated northwards to Numantia. This large fortified city served both as the capital of the Araveci tribe and as the economic, political and military heart of Celtiberian independence in the heart of Spain. There, the Segedans joined forces with the Araveci and their allies and elected a war chief, Carus, to lead them into battle. With typically Roman ruthless efficiency, Nobilior had Segeda levelled before proceeding northwards to Numantia. While the consul was marching his army through a thick forest, he was ambushed by Carus's army, comprised of 20,000 Celtiberian footmen and 500 cavalry, who poured out from the tree line and smashed into the Roman column with a fury. Appian, who recorded this encounter, did not specify the exact location of this forest. Wherever it was, it would forever be a legionary's graveyard, for Carus achieved a splendid victory there, his warriors cutting down over 6,000 Roman citizens. Once the Romans began routing, the Celtiberians pursued disorderly, with the fearless Carus at the head, performing prodigies of valour in combat, according to Appian. Here, the Roman cavalry, who had been guarding the baggage train at the rear of the column, regrouped and fell upon Carus, cutting him down. Now deprived of their leader, the rest of the Celtiberians withdrew. Nobilior's army, despite being heavily bloodied, would survive to fight another day. Nevertheless, for centuries thereafter, the Romans would refuse to engage in any battles on the day of the festival of their god Vulcan, for their humiliation at the hands of Carus's Celtiberians had occurred on that day. With their general dead, the coalition of tribes elected 2 new chieftains, named Ambo and Luco, to take his place as leaders of the anti-Roman war effort. Meanwhile, en route to Numantia, Nobilior's legions were reinforced by 300 Numidian light cavalry and 10 war elephants from Rome's ally in North Africa. When the Romans arrived at the rebel stronghold, they found that an indigenous army had formed battle lines before the walls and intended to engage them in a pitched battle. Nobilior divided his army into 2 and advanced, placing the war elephants in the rear. Only when the 2 armies were about to clash did the consul order the Roman wings to part, revealing the great trunked beasts. The natives, having never seen such monsters before, were thunderstruck and fled back into their fortress. Nobilior ordered an assault on the walls, and a fierce battle commenced. In the ensuing chaos, Appian describes a rather chaotic turn of events. One of the elephants was struck on the head with a large falling stone, whereupon he became savage, turning upon his friends and destroying everything that came in his way, making no distinction between friend and foe. The other elephants, excited by his cries, all began to do the same, trampling the Romans underfoot, scattering and hurling them this way and that. The Romans took to disorderly flight. When the Numantines perceived this, they sallied out and pursued them, killing about 4,000 men and 3 elephants. They also captured many arms and standards. At the end of the day, Nobilior had been hoisted on his own pachydermic petard, and Numantia had held firm against the Roman onslaught. Withdrawing in disgrace, Nobilior attempted an assault on the town of Axinium, which Appian enigmatically describes as having accomplished nothing. Moreover, while withdrawing from there, he was once again ambushed by the Celtiberians, who managed to slay his master of cavalry, Baesius. This landslide of Roman disasters compelled the town of Oculis to defect to the rebels, another severe blow to the Republic's war effort since their provisions were stored there. Completely hobbled, the Roman expedition could do nothing but retreat in despair to their winter camp, where many of the men died to food shortages and the blistering cold. Nobilior's campaign to subdue the Celtiberians had been a complete failure, and to no one's surprise, he was sacked the following year. In 152 BC, he was replaced as consul by Marcus Claudius Marcellus. Upon landing in Iberia, at the head of 8,000 infantry and 500 cavalry, Marcellus was immediately more successful than his predecessor. He managed to avoid ambushes shrewdly, and rather than assault the imposing walls of Numantia head-on, he ground down the natives' resolve to fight by laying waste to their relatively less defensible countryside. Eventually it became evident that despite their valour and fighting spirit, the Celtiberians simply did not have the resources or manpower to continue fighting the Roman war machine, which would just keep sending army after army into their lands in perpetuity until they were ground down into dust. Thus the Araveci, Belli and Titi tribes approached Marcellus seeking peace. Marcellus sent the envoys of those tribes on to Rome, where they engaged in diplomacy with the Republican Senate. The ultimate end result was a return to the status quo ante bellum, with the tribes reaffirming their adherence to the treaties their fathers had signed with Sempronius Gracchus a generation ago, which effectively put them back under indirect Roman overlordship. Marcellus's diplomatic acumen might have brought lasting peace, if not for the abject brutality of his successors, Lucius Licinius Lucullus and Servius Sulpicius Galba, the praetors of Citteria and Ulteria respectively. In 151, Lucullus waged a genocidal campaign in the lands of the Vicae tribe, a grotesque endeavour that even Appian, a Roman writer, condemns as the folly of a man greedy only for fame and money. The governor of Citteria then linked up with his counterpart in Ulteria, where they put an end to the Lusitanian War, which had been raging on since 155 BC, promising the Lusitanians peace and leniency if they put down their arms and surrendered to Rome, only to commit a treacherous massacre once they did. One of the survivors of this massacre, a Lusitani named Viriathos, channeled his rage towards the Republic into another massive rebellion that would plunge the Iberian Peninsula back into chaos for another 20 years. Soon the Celtiberians had joined the Lusitani, picked up their falcata blades, and resolved to make one last attempt to throw off the Roman yoke. The result was the Third Celtiberian War, also known as the Numantine War, for the fortress of Numantia was once more the nexus of the indigenous war effort, and poetically, the place where Celtiberian independence would end permanently. In 133, the great fortress city fell after a prolonged siege, mastered by the Roman statesman Scipio Aemilianus, who starved its defenders into submission. After this, most of Hispania fell under Roman control. Nevertheless, insurrection and rebellion remained endemic in the region. The entire peninsula didn't come under the empire's dominion until after the Cantabrian Wars in 19 BC, rounding out a mind-boggling 200 years of struggle. Paradoxically, one of the first territories the Romans conquered outside Italy was also the one it struggled the longest against to completely pacify, a testimony to the valor of the Iberians.
It is now that our story shifts east, to the sun-baked highlands of central Anatolia. Here dwelt the Galatians, a collection of Celtic tribes who had been transplanted into the region as a byproduct of King Brenos's failed invasion of Greece in 279 BC. Living amidst a sea of Greek-speaking successor states to Alexander's Macedonian Empire, the Galatians had adopted many of the trappings of classical Greek culture. They primarily made their fortunes as career mercenaries, as their Gallic ferocity made them the ideal shock troopers in any ambitious Macedonian king's army. For a century, the Gauls of Anatolia earned a fortune pillaging the fortunes of Greek rulers on behalf of other Greek rulers. At the turn of the 2nd century, the Galatian tribes attached themselves to the army of the Hellenic world's mightiest king, Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire. One has to imagine that the Gauls assumed this would be a contract like any other. They were wrong. Antiochus was engaged in a struggle for hegemony over the Greek-speaking world with none other than the Roman Republic. Inevitably, the Seleucid king's ambitions would turn to ash in his mouth when his cataphracts, war elephants, scythed chariots, and Gallic mercenaries were decisively defeated by the Romans and their Pergamene allies at the Battle of Magnesia in 191 BC. With the Seleucids humbled by the Scipio brothers, the Roman consul Gnaeus Manlius Vulso proposed that the Republic should expand into the highlands of Galatia. The official pretext for war was that the Galatians had fought alongside the Seleucids, but in truth, Rome was probably lusting after the rich plunder that the Anatolian Gauls had accumulated over their century of mercenary work.
In the campaigning season of 189 BC, Consul Gnaeus Manlius Vulso began mustering his forces in the city of Ephesus, where he was reinforced by some auxiliary forces from Rome's ally, the king of Pergamon, Eumenes II. Vulso then set forth on his campaign, arriving on the border of the territory of the Telistobogii, one of the 3 major Galatian tribes. According to Livy, who once more is the closest thing we have to a contemporary account of events, Vulso fired up his legionaries with a speech. Of all the nations inhabiting Asia, the Gauls are preeminent for military fame, Their tall persons, their long red hair, their vast shields, swords of enormous length, their yells and dances, and the horrid clashing of their armour, all these circumstances are preconcerted to inspire terror. But let Greeks, Phrygians, and Carians, to whom these things are unusual and strange, be frightened by such acts. To the Romans, accustomed to Gallic tumults, even these vain efforts to strike terror are known. Once our ancestors fled from them, but it was long ago, when they first met them at the Alia. Ever since that time, the Romans drive them before them in dismay and kill them like cattle. Despite making his utter contempt for the Celts of Anatolia obvious, Vulso still attempted to secure victory through diplomacy before attempting it by the sword. To that end, he sent envoys to Epizognatus, a Galatian chieftain friendly to Rome. Epizognatus promised to convince the other chieftains among the three tribes to submit peacefully to the Republic. Encouraged by this, Vulso marched inland, where he encamped his army near the Telistobogi stronghold of Cobalum and awaited further word. Here he was greeted not by friendly envoys, but by mounted Galatian raiders, who launched a sudden attack on the Roman camp, inflicting light casualties before being driven off by the Roman cavalry. Vulso broke camp and marched on the Galatian-inhabited city of Gordium, which the Romans discovered to be completely abandoned. Epizognatus' messengers reached the consul and told him the obvious, that their chieftain had failed to convince the Galatians to submit to Roman authority. Furthermore, they reported that the vast bulk of the Telistobogi and Trogmi, under the leadership of one Chief Ortiagon, had retreated to the mountain of Bithynian Olympus, where over 50,000 warriors, alongside their women and children, had entrenched themselves. Meanwhile, the Tectosagis had retreated to Mount Magaba, adopting a similar defensive strategy. When Vulso's army reached the foot of Bithynian Olympus, they discovered that the Telistobogi and Trogmi had encamped themselves at the summit of the mountain, where they had dug a ditch and erected defensive works around their position. They hoped that by forcing the Romans to climb the steep and freezing slopes of the mountain, they would exhaust their foe and make them easier to repel. Vulso pitched camp 5 miles away from the mountain, then instructed his men to prepare many missile weapons, including javelins, arrows, balls of lead, and stones. The consul then mustered his cavalry and personally led 2 scouting missions up the slopes. On the first sortie, they were accosted and driven back by a vanguard of Gallic horsemen. On the second, Vulso was able to successfully reconnoitre, discovering that there were 3 viable ways to march his army up the mountain. One at the middle of the mountain, where the ground was earthy, and 2 others, both very difficult, one on the southeast and the other on the northwest. After making the appropriate divinations and sacrifices, Vulso launched his attack, directing his army into 3 divisions. The consul personally led the greatest part of his forces and marched up where the mountain afforded the easiest ascent. Meanwhile, he ordered his brother Lucius Manlius and his subordinate Caius Helvius to carefully climb the far more treacherous southeastern and northwestern slopes. Expecting the Romans to only advance up the facile path, the Galatians sent an advance guard of 4,000 men to garrison a hill overlooking the main road. Here they encountered Vulso's main contingent, and the battle was joined. Immediately, the Roman velites and the king of Pergamon's Cretan archers and slingers began unleashing a barrage of missiles upon the Gauls. Arrows, javelins, and lead balls shredded through them to devastating effect, for the Gauls had little body armor, and their shields, long but too narrow for the breadth of their bodies, ill protected them. When the Gallic vanguard attempted to charge down the Roman line, their numbers were thinned by more missile fire, then they were cut down by the velites' swords upon impact. Routed into a panic, the Gauls retreated back into their camp at the mountain summit. Around this time, Lucius Manlius and Caius Helvius had finished their ascents. All 3 contingents now closed in on the Galatian stockade and unleashed hellfire upon it. Javelins, arrows, rocks, and lead balls rained upon the unarmored and exposed Gauls, alongside their families, who were holed up in their camp with them. As a rather macabre anecdote, Livy notes that it was only by hearing the wailing and screaming of their women and children that the Romans knew their missiles were properly devastating the Galatian warriors. Eventually, once the enemy's numbers had been properly thinned out, Vulso ordered the camp to be stormed, and the Romans overran it almost immediately. The Gauls fled from the stockade and fled down the mountainside in all directions, but thousands were cut down or captured. All told, in the Battle of Mount Olympus, 10,000 Galatians were slain and 30,000 taken into bondage. Roman casualties were minimal. 3 days after crushing the Tlistobogi and Trocmi, Vulso marched for Mount Magaba to grind the Tectosagis under his heel. The Tectosagis sent envoys to the consul, offering peace and submission, but this proved to be a ploy to make him lower his guard, ambushing him with a large force of their cavalry while he was proceeding to a diplomatic parley. Vulso only managed to avoid being captured by the skin of his teeth, with a contingent of Roman foragers fighting off the Gallic horsemen. After this, he doggedly proceeded on to Mount Magaba, where, employing the same tactics he had used at Bithynian Olympus, he crushed the Tectosage host. After this, total victory belonged to Rome, and the land of the Gauls in Asia was now de facto under the overlordship of the Republic, after Gnaeus Manlius Vulso's triumph.
Anatolian Gauls remained nominally independent, but increasingly bound to the will of Rome. After the Republic absorbed Pergamon in 133 BC, the Galatians became a useful buffer state, who the Romans used to wage a proxy war on their Cappadocian and Pontic enemies. During the Mithridatic Wars, the Galatians were faithful allies to Pompey the Great in his struggle against the Pontic king Mithridates. In 25 BC, after nearly 150 years of gradual Romanization, Galatia was finally annexed and became a province of the empire. Now let us dial back the clock to the 2nd century BC and return to northern Italy. With the Alps in Rome's control, the proverbial door was open for its legions to march into the region of the Gallic world roughly corresponding to modern France, the very heart of the Celtic La Tène world. The catalyst for this came in the form of the Greek city of Massalia, which had a complicated centuries-long relationship with the Celtic tribes they were surrounded by. By the 2nd century BC, they had also become close allies and trading partners with the rising star that was Rome. So in 154 BC, when the Gallic Saluvii tribe threatened to invade them, the Greeks called for the Romans to help. The Republic was happy for an excuse to send its legions beyond the Alps, and helped defend Massalia from the Saluvii twice, once in 154 and again in 125. After the second bout, the Romans magnanimously offered to assume control of Massalia's hinterlands to protect them from further Gallic incursions. The Greeks, caring more about trade than territorial integrity, agreed. Meanwhile, the defeated Saluvii king, Teutometulos, had fled north to the territory of the Allobroges, who were closely allied to the Arverni. This gave the Romans the perfect casus belli to pursue an expansionist campaign into the rich lands of these two tribes. Under the pretext of chasing Teutometulos, they invaded the territory of the Allobroges and Arverni, and by 121 BC had conquered much of southern France. They incorporated it into their empire as the province of Transalpine Gaul, which meant Gaul beyond the Alps, named in juxtaposition to Cisalpine Gaul, Gaul within the Alps. After the establishment of the province of Transalpine Gaul, later renamed Gallia Narbonensis, the frontier between the Celts and the Romans remained relatively stable and even friendly for the better part of a century. One example of this was the Celtic Federation of Noricum, which by the late 2nd century BC had developed a mutually symbiotic relationship with Rome. The skilled metallurgists of the region provided the Republic with much of the steel they needed to equip their legions, and in turn, the legions provided them with military protection. Consequently, when the Germanic, Cimbri and Teutonese people invaded Noricum in 113 BC, the Romans were quick to defend their Gallic allies. at the turn of the 1st century BC, trade between Rome and various Celtic tribes had begun to flourish, with a complex system of trade networks and treaties existing between them. It can be easy to imagine commerce between these two as a one-sided relationship whereby the barbarous Gauls coveted the riches of the Romans, but this was not the case. The Gauls profited greatly off Roman wine, but Rome also had much to gain in Celtic goods, from their excellent metalwork to other radical Gallic inventions like the wooden barrel and soap. Nevertheless, the relationship between the Latin and Celtic worlds would deteriorate once more in the 50s BC, when a certain Gaius Julius Caesar became governor of Cisalpine and Transalpine Gaul, setting the stage for perhaps the single most iconic campaign of conquest in Roman history. What began, at least on paper, as an expedition to prevent the migration of hostile tribes into Roman territory, soon evolved into the full-scale subjugation of the entire Gallic heartland, resulting in an immortal duel between the erstwhile triumvir and the valiant Arverni chieftain Vercingetorix. This is the most famous clash between the Celtic and Roman worlds, but it's also the one we'll devote the least time to in this video, as we've already made a 90-minute long documentary exhaustively covering it, which we'll make available in the description below. Regardless, we all know how the story ends. When Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia and threw his arms at the feet of the Roman consul who had defeated him, the independence of the Gallic world had come to an end. By the year 50 BC, the Gallic world of continental Europe had all but disappeared. The Celtic territories of Eastern and Central Europe that had not been subsumed by Rome were eventually replaced by waves of migration by the Dacians, Iranic Sarmatian pastoralists, and early Germanic tribes. The rest, of course, were now under the shadow of the imperial eagle's wing. By 50 BC, Celtic continental Europe had been brought under the Roman eagle through no small cost of blood. But this was not the end of their story. The native Celtic population still vastly outnumbered the colonial Latin presence, and their still functioning infrastructure was co-opted into the new Roman system. Major Gallic hill fort sites like Conditum, Lutetia, Lugdunum, Mediolanum, Serdica, and Ancyra were all turned into Roman towns, as clusters of wattle and daub houses were replaced with gridded streets, public baths, and gymnasiums. Despite the new management, these cities still served as the power center of a local Gallic tribe, much like the old hill forts. Outside of the cities, life did not initially change much for the Celts. The majority of them had been rural farmers, and under Roman rule, they lived in the same tribal villages as their ancestors, speaking the same Celtic languages and cultivating the same crops. To the Arvernian cooper or Armorican shepherd, it must have made little difference whether they paid a portion of their labours to a torque-wearing chieftain or to a toga-clad governor. As a result, the majority of the Gallic population would not fully Latinize for centuries. This assimilation did occur relatively faster among the higher castes, as the Romans focused on controlling their subject peoples from the top down. Many Celtic chieftains had been regularly interacting with Rome for centuries, and had already developed a substantially Romanized material culture, and this process sped up as many Gallic rulers sent their children off to receive a Roman education. The army served as another vehicle of assimilation, as Gauls who had been part of the aristocratic warrior caste signed up for the legion as auxiliaries, which served as an acceptable substitute to the proud Celtic warrior tradition. They learned Latin, and provided offerings to the imperial cult shrines present at every castra fort. Upon their retirement, they earned full Roman citizenship, cementing their integrated role in imperial society. Apart from the mandatory observance of the aforementioned imperial cult, which held the Roman emperors as divine beings to be revered, subject peoples were otherwise free to worship whatever deities they wished, resulting in Celtic polytheism surviving well into the imperial era. Romans and Celts drew parallels between their gods, The thunder god Taranis was associated with the Roman Jupiter, while the warlike tribal protector Tutatis was likened to Mars. Some Celtic deities even became adopted by the Roman population, such as the horse goddess Epona, who became the patron of equestrians across the empire. However, there were limits to this cohabitation. The Druids, for example, were often the target of Roman persecution. Their suppression began under the reign of Emperor Tiberius and intensified under Emperor Claudius. Anti-Druidic policies were usually enacted under the pretext of ending ritual human sacrifice, but realistically, it was because the Druids threatened Roman control. Indeed, several Gallic rebellions were attributed to the seeds of discontent that Druids sowed from the shadows. Nevertheless, theirs was a clandestine order that proved hard to stamp out, and it is exceedingly likely that for generations, the Druids secretly continued their teachings in hidden caves and secret forest clearings. During the reign of Claudius, select Gallic aristocrats were granted the privilege of joining the Roman Senate. Many snobbish senators protested this move fervently. How could the emperor allow barbarians to sit among their hallowed ranks? In response, Claudius reminded them, matter-of-factly, that they themselves were the descendants of Umbrans, Sabines, and Samnites, Italic tribes the Romans had conquered and assimilated centuries earlier. To him, the Gauls were just the latest in a long line of peoples to be integrated into the grand imperial project. From the 3rd century AD, a new faith had taken the empire by storm, whose practitioners worshipped a strange Levantine prophet that the Romans themselves had put to death 200 years earlier. The Christian faith spread rapidly through the provinces, first as a persecuted underground cult, and then, through a remarkable turn of fortunes, the state religion of the empire. Imperial opinions towards old gods quickly soured, and by 392 AD, the devoutly Christian emperor Theodosius banned all pagan practices entirely. This was probably the death knell of whatever remained of traditional Celtic polytheism on the continent. The next century would see the end of the world that the Gallo-Romans had lived under for generations. After the conquest of the Celts, the Germanic peoples had become the principal barbarian enemy of Rome. For centuries, many of their tribes had traded, integrated, or more often warred with Romans along the frontier of the Rhine and Danube rivers. In many ways, the 400s CE was the Germanic century, as peoples like the Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks took advantage of imperial decay to pour into Roman territory and carve out kingdoms for themselves, thereby bringing an end to the western half of the empire. As the Germanic invaders of Europe settled into their newly conquered lands, they found themselves living amongst the direct descendants of chieftains and druids, men who had once called themselves the warriors of the Senones, Insubres, Boii, and Averni. But these people had been forever changed. Indeed, by the time the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Celts of continental Europe had been under Latin hegemony for over 400 years, and Gaulish culture had become little more than an echo. Its ancient cults had been replaced by a monotheistic god from the Levant, and its language had been slowly declining in favour of the dialects of Vulgar Latin that would evolve into today's modern Romance languages. It is possible that the Gaulish language survived in some isolated mountain villages as late as the 6th century AD, but as late antiquity transitioned into the Middle Ages, the Celtic identity had all but faded away, and a hybrid Germanic-Latin custom would be the predominant culture upon which most of the kingdoms of early medieval Europe were formed.
Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Enter PvP for all skill levels in this massive vehicle combat game on PC or consoles, and make sure to grab our large free bonus pack with premium features. Get it all via our link down in the description. The centuries after the fall of Rome did not bring about the extinction of Celtic culture in Europe, for there remained one foggy island on the edge of the continent where the native peoples still held to a distinctively Celtic language and identity. Indeed, the history and ultimate fate of the Celtic Britons is one we have not yet touched upon, for they stand apart from their continental cousins in two ways. They were never fully conquered by the Romans, and their indigenous identity outlived the empire which subjugated them. In our next long-form documentary on the ancient Celtic peoples, we will tell the story of ancient Britain, from the tragic tale of Queen Boudica to the unconquerable Picts and Caledones of the north, to the myths which gave rise to the story of King Arthur. So stay and make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive videos. Join the ranks of patrons and YouTube members via the link in the description or by pressing the button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, join our private Discord, and much more. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.